What caused the downfall of Kirk Cousins, and just how bright is Michael Penix's future in Atlanta?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. So, guys, if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as every day. So that means you make this illustrious podcast your first listen each and every day. And becoming every day, all you have to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are starting our positional reviews as we await the Falcons D-line coach hire. They interviewed somebody today from the Houston Texans, Nate Otley. And so we'll see if the Falcons wind up hiring him or bring in other folks. So we'll probably discuss that later in the week. But we'll start our positional review, starting with the quarterback position as this rest of this week unfolds. Talk about the bright future ahead for Michael Penix. But if the Falcons are going to Falcon and ruin that bright future, but we got to start this conversation with, where it all went wrong for the Falcons at the quarterback position. And that was the downfall of Kirk Cousins. Right. And I look back at this past year, and I know a lot of other folks will disagree with this sentiment, but I don't look back at the year of Kirk Cousins, or less than the year of Kirk Cousins, as the utter disaster that I think some people will play it up to be. Right. That I look back when we were doing our sort of look ahead to the offseason during the bye week, we talked about how, hey, we're going to have a conversation about moving on from Kirk Cousins, but that's probably not going to be a real conversation because it's not really, financially feasible for the Falcons to do that. But basically a week later, it suddenly become, it didn't become more financially feasible, but it became much more of a reality than a hypothetical. And so when I look back at this Kirk Cousins seasons, I really do look back at that Chargers game, that week 13 matchup coming out of the bye week where Kirk threw 4 interceptions as kind of where it all went wrong for Kirk Cousins. And I know we lumped that game into that 4-game stint where Kirk, did not throw a touchdown and threw 9 interceptions during that game, 4 of which came in that Chargers game and 5 of which coming against the New Orleans Saints in week 10, the Denver Broncos in week 11 before the bye. And then after that week 13 loss to the Chargers, the week 14 loss to the Vikings where Kirk threw 2 more picks. But as I said on the podcast then and still maintain now, I think when you look at that 4-game stint in isolation, I don't think Kirk played that particularly poorly across those 4 games as I think the stats would indicate, right? I think he played reasonably well in the Saints and Vikings game. It's just the Falcons failed to finish drives in those 2 games, right? Younghoe Koo missed a bunch of field goals in that Saints game, while Kirk was part of their inability to finish drives in those games. But, that Saints game also featured that one instance where it took the Falcons 4 tries to run the ball in from the 1-yard line. Right. You look at that Vikings game and I still, think that Ray McLeod's 4th quarter fumble and the Falcons 12 penalties had far more to do with the Falcons losing that game than Kirk Cousins. And I don't think Kirk played well against the Vikings, but I don't feel like it's fair to kind of single him out for his poor performance in that game in comparison to pretty much everybody else on the team that played poorly. That seems unfair. So to me, it does really look like in a lot of ways. It's just kind of that Chargers game that kind of stands out above the rest as, sort of the game that caused the downfall of Kirk Cousins. And, there's really no defense for Kirk's performance in that game. And it's not to say that he was perfect in the other 13 starts he had this past season. But, I feel like a lot of those issues, those ups and downs, the inconsistencies, all that stuff were forgivable, considering it was his first year in the offense, year 1 working with this coaching staff, year 1 working with these players. And sort of at the time, as we talked about during the bye week, like the expectation was things should get better in year 2 for Kirk Cousins. We just have to kind of power through this year 1 and hopefully, things will work out. But of course they didn't. So that's part of the reason why I don't sit here and look at this past year with Kirk Cousins as a disaster, right? Now, certainly I think you have far more criticism for the contract that the Falcons gave than necessarily the play on the field. right? And I think seeing the results, it's completely fair for people to question that process when it came to giving Kirk that contract that is now going to, hang over this franchise for the next 2 off seasons. But again, I don't necessarily look at that as the process being flawed, given that the Falcons desperately needed stability at the quarterback position, and with the pressure for the new coaching staff to come in and immediately get results by making the playoffs, because that's why they fired the old coaching staff, because they didn't make the playoffs. To me, the choice of the Falcons to go after Kirk Cousins, I think, was the right choice. And I explained this several times on the podcast last February when we talked about it on a near daily basis for multiple weeks, and why the Falcons were likely to go after Kirk Cousins. So that's part of the reason why I don't see, while we didn't get the right results, I think the process was fine, right? Of course, again, the question is, why didn't the Falcons get those results? And again, I think the narrative is going to be, well, simply because Kirk Cousins stinks. And again, I feel like it's more Zach Robinson not living up to the hype, right? We talked about that during the offseason, where to me, the bet of the upcoming 2024 season was less a Kirk Cousins bet and more of a Zach Robinson bet. And so the expectations from a lot of us, myself included, was that Zach Robinson would prove himself to be one of the bright young minds in the NFL. And I don't think he quite did that. All right. And I've touched upon that in recent episodes of the podcast. But it's worth revisiting some of those topics, which is what gives me the majority of my pause on why I don't necessarily look as optimistically to the bright future that, is ahead for Michael Penix. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So when you're looking to start the 2025 calendar year stronger, you want to have more fun this year than you had in 2024. And maybe that means going to more live events. And that's where Gametime comes in, where, they can help you get to those sports and the comedy and the music and the theater, all those live events, right? They make getting tickets easier thanks to their new feature, Gametime Picks. This feature is going to filter out the fluff and show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. And whether you're trying to get in to Mercedes-Benz Stadium for the national championship game, or you're looking ahead to Atlanta Hawks games, Gametime is going to offer you great seats with unbeatable prices. And we love the what you see is what you get features in the app, right? When you toggle the all-in prices on in the app, you get the total cost up front. Don't have to worry about hidden fees. And we all love the panoramic seat views that allow you to preview what you're going to be seeing at your chosen event. So download the Gametime app, create an account, and make sure you use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Gametime. So again, the narrative this offseason is going to be that the Falcons' shortcomings stem from the old quarterback, in this case, Kirk Cousins, and that they have a bright future ahead with the new quarterback, in this case, Michael Penix. But this has been the same exact narrative that we've heard to varying degrees over the last 3 off seasons. It hasn't proven true. And, I remain skeptical on whether it's going to be right a fourth time's a charm. And so but that's not going to stop anybody from pushing the exact same narrative. And again, that's part of the reason why I'm a little less enthusiastic about the Penix hype than others. And, people will label me as a Penix hater, in part because I defended Kirk Cousins down the stretch, in part because I didn't react to the Penix pick in as positive a way as people wanted. Although I stand by what I said about the opportunity cost conversation that we had back in May. And the Falcons wound up having the worst pass rush in the NFL for 70% of this past season, and I think that's a bigger contributing factor, I would argue, than missing the playoffs than the quarterback was. But my skepticism has little to do with Michael Penix himself, right? I'll go on record and say that I'm optimistic about Michael Penix. I think he showed in those final 3 games of the 2024 season that he has all the tools and potential to be one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. The question is, how good a quarterback can he be? And to me, the question centers on the Atlanta Falcons, right? It's the nature versus nurture debate. I like Michael Penix's nature. The question is whether or not the Falcons can nurture it. And that's why I'm skeptical, right? Because at this point, right now, sitting here on January 20th, right, I have very little trust that the Atlanta Falcons are going to get this right. I did 2 videos, essentially why? Because I did 2 videos back in July for the Locked On Falcons Insiders, looking at the Rams offense, looking at the Vikings offense from 2023 to sort of tell you about, okay, this is what this Falcons offense may look like in 2024, showcasing a lot of the changes that I expected from the Falcons offense, changes that the Falcons really didn't implement into this offense until after Kirk's benching in late December or mid-December. And so simply put, part of my skepticism is like, I figured out what this offense should be in July, and it took this coaching staff until December to figure that out. And that doesn't fill me with confidence, right? An example of that was that, Kirk, given his limited mobility coming off the Achilles injury, wasn't going to be able to run the bootlegs off of outside zone that you needed to. So making outside zone your staple run play doesn't make a ton of sense if the goal is to marry your run game to your play action passing game, right? And instead, the Falcons should switch it up and run more split zone as their sort of staple run play, because that will require less mobility on the part of Kirk Cousins and whatnot. And basically, the Falcons didn't run their first split zone play action play until that Giants game in Penix's first start. And to me, some people may see that as a positive. I see that as a major red flag, that it took them that long to figure that out, right? It took you 5 months, And again, I know I come off as, this expert here on this podcast, but, I'm so humble, right? I'm your humble host, right? I don't know all that much about football, but like, I shouldn't be, knowing more about what this offense should look like than the people that are actually running the offense, right? It's part of the reason why I kind of joke about, this coaching staff being everydayers, because so often this past year, we would come on the podcast and be like, okay, the Falcons did this X, Y, and Z wrong, and they need to do A, B, and C next week. And then the Falcons would come out and do A, B, and C. And it's like, do you guys actually know what you're doing? Like, and so that's the big question I have. Is this coaching staff actually good at their jobs? They talk the talk, but so far they haven't really walked the walk. And certainly the Jeff Ulbrich hire isn't necessarily inspiring me with a ton more confidence. And so when we saw Kirk go into that slump, I don't think the play calling really did much to try to get him out of it. Basically, their solution was we'll just lean more on the run game. And so I wonder a little bit about if and when Michael Penix goes through the typical ups and downs that you see for a first-year starter in the NFL, what is this coaching staff going to do in those situations to either break him out of something, either avoid those ups and downs or to turn those downs into ups? I don't know. That's what gives me pause with this coaching staff going into year 2 here in Atlanta. And so again, the narrative is going to be, they couldn't figure out all that stuff because Kirk Cousins stinks. And it'll all magically come together because Michael Penix is all that in a bag of chips. And again, that's not a shot at Michael Penix. I just think that's a very naive perspective. But I do expect significant improvement for this coaching staff in year 2, especially from the Falcons offensive coordinator, Zach Robinson. I outlined 3 areas where I think he needs to improve last week on the podcast: the play action passing game, the diversifying the run game, and then marrying that run game to their play action passing game. And if he can do all 3 of those things, I think this team will be successful. I look at a team like Washington, who's now going to be in the NFC Championship game. They were basically the team that the Falcons were, right? Where we outlined on, I think, Thursday, the Falcons were basically the worst play action passing team in the NFL this past season. Well, Washington was that team in 2023 with Sam Howell and Eric Bieniemy. And again, they didn't go from worst to first, but they were in the upper half of the league in a lot of areas when it came to their play action passing game. And I think that's a big thing that fueled the early success of Jaden Daniels, as well as that Washington team, and why they're in a position where they might be able to go to a Super Bowl in less than a week. So we've seen year 2 improvements here in Atlanta from previous play callers before Zach Robinson, Arthur Smith, Dirk Cutter, Steve Sarkisian, Kyle Shanahan were all better play callers in their second years in Atlanta than they were in their first years. However, Smith, Cutter, and Sark, despite that improvement, it didn't quite get the team into the playoffs, right? Shanahan's the only one that was able to achieve that off. And, a lot of that had to do with, some of the investments that the Falcons made on their offense in that subsequent offseason going into his second year. And so, again, I remain skeptical because I'm like, I think when I'm comparing Zach Robinson and what he did in year 1 to what, his 4 predecessors did in year 1, he looks a lot more like the 3 quote unquote lesser guys in Arthur Smith, Dirk Cutter, and Steve Sarkisian than he looks like the next Kyle Shanahan. He kind of needs to be the next Kyle Shanahan in order, if this team wants to reach their goals in 2025. And I don't see Alex Mack or Mo Sanu or Taylor Gabriel, Austin Hooper, or Aldrick Robinson walking through that door. I don't expecting some internal year 2 jump from Tevin Coleman that we got in 2016. I'm not expecting KC Washington to make that jump, guys. So we'll see if Michael Penix is the guy that makes that jump. So we really need him to be that guy that makes that year 2 jump. So we'll see if things live up to the hype. But I continue to showcase all the reasons why I remain skeptical. But let's for once be positive on this podcast. It was so rare to be positive on this podcast. And let's talk about the bright young star quarterback that the Falcons have in Michael Penix. So it's playoff time, and you're like me, and you want to get the most out of these final weeks of football action, and that's where PrizePicks comes in. Because if you love football and you want a chance to win real money by watching the games, PrizePicks is the place for you, and it's easy on PrizePicks. That's why there's over 10 million members, because all you got to do is pick more or less on at least 2-player stat projections, and you can watch the winnings roll in up to 1,000 times your money, right? I'm going to get potentially up to 5 times my money with my projections for the conference championship game, where I went more on Josh Allen, more on James Cook, more on Saquon Barkley on, 0.5 rushing and receiving touchdowns. Those guys combined for 46 touchdowns, rushing and receiving touchdowns this year. And so it's that simple, right? These guys are like, take it to the bank that they're going to score a touchdown almost every single week. And so I'm going to win up to 5 times my money. You can win up to 1,000 times your money. That's how simple it is. All you got to do is download the PrizePicks app and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, use that code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. You don't even have to win. It's guaranteed. PrizePicks, run your game. So I've already talked about the different ways that Michael Penix, I think, can elevate this offense over what Kirk Cousins was able to do this past year. I talked about that, I believe, on last Tuesday's episode. But for you non-everydayers, how dare you? We will revisit some of those issues, right? And so we saw the flashes of all the things that we needed to see to believe into the bright future of Michael Penix in those final 3 weeks, right? The main thing was the poise, right? The big moments, the fact that the Falcons basically threw him to the wolves in a you have to win these games or not, or the season's over type of situation. The moment wasn't too big for Michael Penix. And so that's a huge factor for his, future in Atlanta. We saw the big time arm that led to a lot of big time throws, especially in that week 18 finale against the Panthers, right? And you need that, right? You need to be able to hit those big time throws if you're going to be a high level quarterback in the NFL, right? Gone are the days of the Alex Smiths where you can just kind of dink and dunk your way, down the field. And so Penix has that ability to really elevate the explosive potential of this offense with his arm, being able to attack not only the middle of the field, but outside the numbers and whatnot. And then you also saw the thing that you need to see from a young quarterback, which is, that creation ability, that off structure ability to turn negative plays into positive plays by extending plays outside the pocket with his legs and making throws down the field, basically finding the right answers when, only the wrong answers are presented to you. And that's something that young quarterbacks are going to need, because they're not often going to know what the right answer is going to be. And one example I used was like for Michael Penix until that week 18 finale against Carolina, Tampa 2 seemed to confuse Michael Penix. He was like, I don't know what I'm seeing, because it's probably the first time he's seen it. He eventually figured it out in that week 18 finale. But again, that speaks to not necessarily having all the right answers to the test ahead of time. So, for those reasons, I think there's a lot of excitement in Atlanta about the future of this Falcons quarterback position, excitement that hasn't existed in this city for many, many years, right? And, you can't help but notice, you have a quarterback named Mike that's black and left-handed. And so I think a lot of people are reverting back to the excitement that they had for this franchise and this quarterback, like they had in a lot of Falcon fans that became Falcon fans because of Michael Vick and whatnot. And so I think a lot of people are seeing those parallels between Michael Penix and Michael Vick. But I admit, like, the happiest moment that I say when people ask me what was the happiest you ever were as a Falcon fan was the day I found out that the Falcons were trading him for Michael Vick. So I understand that excitement more than many of you can. They've worn me down over the last 25 years, right? They've beaten it out of me. But the Falcons weren't quite able to capitalize on all that excitement with Michael Vick and turn that into a consistent winning team, right? They had 2 winning seasons over the next 6 years with Michael Vick, right? They could have done it, but they didn't. Right. And so despite these superficial similarities that Michael Penix and Michael Vick have, the real hope is that we're hoping for an outcome closer to Matt Ryan and potentially better than Matt Ryan, who, of course, Matt Ryan being the greatest quarterback in Falcons history. Right. And unlike Michael Vick, Matt Ryan came to Atlanta with a lot of skepticism about his future. Now, that wasn't for me because I was actually the rare Falcon fan that was actually happy about the Falcons selecting Matt Ryan back in 2008, right? But, Matt Ryan went about skeptics and doubters wrong, in the subsequent years, right? And we're seeing similarities with Michael Penix, right? Where a lot of people, including myself, question the selection of Michael Penix at the time. A lot of people, including myself, question if Michael Penix had enough poise to save the Falcons season. A lot of people, including myself, are going to question whether or not Michael Penix is going to be the savior for this football team heading into 2025. And so he'll have a lot of chances to quiet his skeptics and his doubters, just like Matt Ryan did, including myself. So we will see what Michael Penix is able to do with his play this upcoming season. And I am, despite my, mellow tones, am legitimately excited and interested to see what Michael Penix will do, right? There's nothing I would rather do on this podcast, guys, than spend the next several months pumping Penix, right? It feels so good, right? But I just need the Falcons to show me, the Falcons, that is, not Michael Penix, the Falcons to show me that this is not going to be more wasted potential, right? With like the last Mike that played for the quarterback position. So, that excitement may begin, to show on the podcast in the coming months, right? When we get to March in free agency, and this team is actually going out there and signing, needle movers in free agency in April, when the Falcons are drafting guys that are potential needle movers in 2025 that will actually, get on the field at some point this upcoming season, rather than what we saw last year with their last year's draft class. So those are the things I'm looking forward to, right? And so if and when we start seeing more of those things, I can start buying into the bigger picture with the Atlanta Falcons this offseason, and we can, I just can't wait to start pumping Penix, right? So hopefully much brighter days are ahead for this franchise. And I think, it starts with the quarterback position. It doesn't end there, though, right? We're going to talk more about some other positions in the coming days on offense, right? As we gear up for this offseason, get into some of the skill players over the next couple of days, talk about the offensive line as well, before I make my way down to Mobile, Alabama for the 2025 Senior Bowl. And we'll start looking ahead to some potential guys that could be on the Falcons draft radar, should they manage to acquire some draft picks, for once, and not be stuck with the 5 limited picks that they have. And, we'll at least probably one of those guys will be a Senior Bowl guy. So we'll get a chance to see him. So that is what's in store for you guys in the coming days here on the podcast. Continue to make us your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll see what's next for this Atlanta Falcon team. Talk, about how incredible Bijan Robinson is on tomorrow's episode. We'll probably talk a little bit about whether or not the Falcons can acquire some of those picks by trading Tyler Algier. That will be a topic of conversation as well. So that is what is in store for you, as well as, what moves the Falcons make to improve their D-line with a D-line coach hire that hopefully will be a little bit more inspiring than the Jeff Ulbrich hire. At least so far, the rumored name, Nate Ollie, seems a little bit more inspiring because outside of the 1 year he was with Jeff Ulbrich in New York in 2021, he's only been around good defensive lines in Philadelphia, Indianapolis, and Houston. So that is a positive. So, let's get excited about a D-line hire, because Lord knows the Falcons won't let us get excited about a defensive coordinator hire. So we'll see what's what on that end, guys, but there's more to come here on Locked On Falcons. And of course, there's more to come on the Locked On Podcast Network. Check out Locked On NFL, 2 shows daily. You get the double shot of espresso first thing in the morning from Tyler Rowland, and then you get that real NFL talk by heading to the barbershop with Tony Wiggins. They're going to keep you up to date on all the things going on into championship weekend around the NFL. The latest hires, right? Ben Johnson heading to Chicago. Lou Anarumo heading to the Indianapolis Colts. What with Dennis Allen? Is he joining Ben in Chicago? All that is available for you on Locked On NFL, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.